The economic historian would pause before speaking and consider the weight of what is unfolding in real time across the northern border. What appears on the surface to be a theatrical exchange between two leaders on social media is actually a structural fracture point in the most integrated trade relationship on Earth. The language matters less than the mechanics underneath. As we move into late January 2026, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stands at the podium, insisting his government has no intention of pursuing a formal free trade agreement with China. He speaks carefully about respecting Canada's obligations under the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, known as CUSMA in Ottawa and USMCA in Washington. But the careful parsing of language reveals something more fundamental. The terms of economic sovereignty are being rewritten in real time, and the mechanism through which this happens is tariff coercion applied to a structurally dependent economy. I'm not a financial advisor. This isn't financial advice. This is an educational analysis based on publicly available information and historical precedent. President Trump threatened a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods if Carney proceeds with what Trump characterizes as a deal with China. The agreement in question, announced on January 16th, allows 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into Canada annually at a tariff rate of 6.1% instead of the 100% tariff that had been in place, in exchange for China reducing tariffs on Canadian canola seed to approximately 15% from 84%, and eliminating tariffs on canola meal, lobsters, crabs, and peas. The arithmetic seems straightforward. Canada gets market access for agricultural exports worth billions. China gets a quota of electric vehicles representing less than 3% of Canada's auto market. What could trigger such an extreme response? The answer lies not in the specific numbers, but in what those numbers represent within a larger structural dependency. Canada's economy exists in a condition that economists might politely call asymmetric integration. In 2024, Canada sent 78% of its total exports to its North American partners, with the overwhelming majority going to the United States. Nearly 3.6 billion Canadian dollars worth of goods and services cross the border each day. About 60% of United States crude oil imports originate in Canada, as do 85% of electricity imports. Canada is also the largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium to the United States. This is not a trade relationship. This is structural dependence. When Trump raised tariffs on non-CUSMA compliant Canadian goods from 25 to 35% in August 2025, citing fentanyl flows and Canadian retaliation, the impact was muted precisely because approximately 95% of Canadian exports qualify under CUSMA and remain tariff-free. That protective shield matters enormously. It is the entire foundation of modern Canadian economic structure. And Article 32.10 of USMCA was written specifically to prevent exactly what Carney just did. Article 32.10 requires USMCA countries to notify the other members 3 months in advance if they intend to begin free trade negotiations with what the agreement terms non-market economies. China is the obvious target. The article permits USMCA countries to review any new free trade deals members agree to, and it allows the other parties to terminate the agreement with 6 months' notice and replace it with a bilateral arrangement. Legal scholars have debated whether this constitutes an actual veto power or merely American posturing. The debate misses the point. When one party controls 95% of your export market access and can impose tariffs at will using emergency powers under domestic law, the distinction between a formal veto and informal coercion becomes academic. The mechanics of how systems break always involve this pattern: apparent stability maintained through institutional arrangements that mask underlying power imbalances, followed by a triggering event that reveals the true balance of forces. The Canada-China tariff arrangement is that triggering event. It is not about electric vehicles or canola. It is about whether Canada retains the ability to make independent economic decisions when those decisions conflict with American strategic priorities. Consider the timing. The USMCA is scheduled for mandatory review in July 2026. Under Article 34.7, the Free Trade Commission must meet to decide whether to extend the agreement to 2042, place it under annual reviews, or allow it to expire in 2036. That review date has been accelerated in practice by Trump's tariff actions throughout 2025. What was supposed to be a routine assessment has become a high-stakes negotiation where the United States holds overwhelming leverage. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated explicitly on January 26th that new tariffs on Canada would depend on whether the United States sees Canada allowing China to use it as a drop-off port for goods entering the American market, and he directly linked this to the USMCA review. The historical pattern here is precise. Economic systems break when the cost of maintaining the status quo exceeds the perceived cost of system collapse for the dominant party. In 1929, the breakdown wasn't caused by the stock market crash itself, but by the structural fragility that made a crash catastrophic: excessive leverage, international gold standard rigidity, and trade policy mistakes, including the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that turned recession into depression. In 2008, the mechanism was different, but the structure identical. Assets that appeared safe were revealed to be backed by nothing, and the institutional arrangements meant to contain risk instead amplified it across the entire system. What we are witnessing in 2026 is a third iteration of this pattern. The institutional arrangement that appeared to provide stability, the USMCA free trade framework, is being revealed as a mechanism of control rather than mutual benefit. The asymmetry was always there. Canadian policymakers understood it, but the system functioned as long as American administrations chose not to weaponize the dependency. Trump's innovation, consistent across both his terms, is the explicit deployment of tariff threats as tools of coercion on matters extending far beyond trade. The fentanyl justification for the 35% tariff, the linkage of Palestine recognition to trade deal prospects, the characterization of the Canadian Prime Minister as Governor Carney. These are not diplomatic gaffes. They are assertions of hierarchical relationship. The mathematics of destruction in this scenario work differently than in 1929 or 2008, but the outcome compounds similarly. When Trump threatens a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods, he is threatening to eliminate the value of 95% of Canadian exports overnight. The Canadian economy in 2024 had a GDP of approximately 2.3 trillion Canadian dollars. Exports to the United States represented roughly 35% of that figure. A 100% tariff doesn't just reduce trade volume, it destroys the business models, supply chains, and capital investments that depend on that trade. Canadian auto parts manufacturers built plants based on USMCA certainty. Alberta energy producers planned decades of investment around American demand. Agricultural operations in the prairies structured their entire production around export markets. Ontario, Premier Doug Ford immediately grasped the implications, calling Chinese electric vehicles spy cars and warning that allowing them into Canada would tick off the Americans and cost Canadian workers their jobs. Ford isn't wrong about the political economy, even if his rhetoric is inflammatory. Ontario contains the bulk of Canada's automotive manufacturing sector, a sector deeply integrated with American production through cross-border supply chains. Those supply chains depend on USMCA protections. If the United States withdraws those protections or simply threatens credibly to do so, the capital investment in Ontario manufacturing evaporates, not gradually, immediately, because the threat itself is sufficient to freeze investment decisions. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe took the opposite position, praising the China deal as very good news for Saskatchewan producers who had been devastated by Chinese tariffs on canola. Canola is a $4 billion market for Canadian producers, and China was the largest customer. When China imposed retaliatory tariffs in 2025, following Canada's imposition of 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, canola exports collapsed. Total exports of canola since August had fallen by more than 2 million tons compared with the same period a year earlier. For prairie agricultural producers, the China deal represented economic survival. For Ontario manufacturers, it represented potential destruction of their American market access. This internal Canadian contradiction reveals why the system is breaking. There is no policy that satisfies both constituencies because the constituencies have been forced into zero-sum competition by the structure of Canada's economic dependence. The agricultural provinces need Chinese market access. The manufacturing provinces need American market access. But the United States is using its leverage over the entire Canadian economy to prevent Canada from pursuing the Chinese relationship. The result is not a stable equilibrium. It is a fragmenting political economy where different regions face opposite economic incentives. The wealth destruction mechanism here operates through investment collapse and supply chain dissolution. When businesses cannot predict whether their goods will face 0% tariffs or 100% tariffs 6 months from now, they stop making long-term capital commitments. They don't expand facilities. They don't hire workers. They don't invest in research and development. The uncertainty itself functions as an economic depressant independent of whether the tariffs are actually imposed. This is why the threat is sufficient. Trump doesn't need to follow through with a 100% tariff to achieve the effect. The credible threat destroys forward-looking investment decisions. Canadian officials have responded by insisting they are not pursuing a formal free trade agreement with China, only a sectoral arrangement on specific products. This is the kind of legalistic distinction that matters in treaty interpretation, but means nothing in the face of overwhelming power asymmetry. The United States can define the China deal as violating the spirit of USMCA regardless of technical compliance with Article 32.10 notification requirements, and the United States can impose costs for that violation through tariffs imposed under domestic emergency authorities that bypass USMCA entirely. This is the key insight that most observers miss. The institutional framework does not constrain American action because American domestic law, specifically the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, provides the president with essentially unlimited authority to impose tariffs when he declares a national emergency. Trump declared such an emergency to justify tariffs based on fentanyl flows. The emergency can be defined to cover anything: drug trafficking, national security, unfair trade practices, or simply policy disagreement. Once the emergency is declared, the USMCA protections become optional from the American perspective. Canada has no equivalent leverage. Canadian retaliatory tariffs hurt American exporters, but don't threaten the American economy structurally. The United States is not dependent on Canadian markets the way Canada is dependent on American markets. In 2024, 30% of United States exports went to Mexico and Canada combined, but this represents a much smaller fraction of American GDP than Canadian exports to the United States represent of Canadian GDP. The asymmetry is structural and cannot be negotiated away. The pattern now accelerates because the July 2026 USMCA review provides a hard deadline that focuses all the accumulated tensions. If Canada proceeds with the China relationship despite American objections, the United States can use the review to extract concessions or threaten non-renewal. If Canada abandons the China deal to preserve USMCA, it signals to every other trading partner that Canadian economic policy is subject to American veto. Either way, the pretense of sovereign economic decision-making collapses, and once that pretense collapses, the capital account responds. Foreign direct investment into Canada in 2024 stood at $732.9 billion, with the United States being the largest source. That investment was predicated on certain assumptions about market access, regulatory stability, and institutional predictability. When those assumptions dissolve, the investment flows reverse, not because Canada becomes less productive or its resources diminish, but because the risk-adjusted return changes. Uncertainty about tariff regimes and market access creates a discount rate that makes Canadian assets less valuable relative to alternatives. The wealth destruction happens through this repricing mechanism before any actual trade disruption occurs. This is why the event feels sudden, even though it was mathematically determined by the structure. The USMCA was never a partnership of equals. It was a managed dependency relationship that functioned as long as the dominant party chose not to press its advantages. Trump's explicit willingness to weaponize that dependency for objectives extending far beyond trade policy, from immigration to fentanyl to China containment, reveals the underlying power structure. Once revealed, it cannot be concealed again. Every future Canadian government will operate with the knowledge that American market access is conditional and revocable. The comparisons to 1929 and 2008 are not hyperbolic when understood through the lens of structural fragility. In 1929, the apparent stability of the late 20s masked extreme leverage and systemic interconnection that amplified shocks. The crash itself was not the cause, it was the revelation of unsustainable structure. In 2008, securitization and derivatives created the appearance of distributed risk when in fact they concentrated systemic fragility. Again, the crisis was not caused by subprime mortgages, but by the discovery that the entire edifice of structured finance rested on false assumptions about correlation and liquidity. In 2026, the false assumption is that institutional frameworks like USMCA create genuine constraints on great power behavior when those powers face strategic competition. The appearance of rules-based order masks raw power politics. China's rise as a strategic competitor to the United States forces every middle power into impossible choices. Canada cannot maintain equivalent relationships with both Beijing and Washington when those two powers are in fundamental competition. The attempt to do so, which is what the China tariff deal represents, triggers the structural break. Most people miss this because they focus on the personalities involved or the specific policy disputes. They see Trump's erratic social media posts and Carney's careful diplomatic language and assume this is about individual leadership styles or negotiating tactics. But systems don't break because leaders make mistakes. Systems break when underlying structural tensions become unsustainable, and some event, often minor in itself, forces a recognition of the true state of affairs. The China-Canada electric vehicle and agricultural tariff arrangement is that event. It is not about 49,000 cars or canola seed pricing. It is about whether middle powers can pursue independent economic policies when great powers compete for strategic dominance. The answer emerging in January 2026 is no, they cannot. And once that answer becomes clear, the entire architecture of globalized trade among unequal partners becomes fragile. The acceleration point comes from timing compression. In normal circumstances, these kinds of structural realignments happen gradually, across years or decades. The British Empire didn't dissolve overnight. The transition from Bretton Woods to floating exchange rates took years of crisis and negotiation. But the USMCA review deadline compresses the timeline. Decisions that might have evolved slowly are being forced into a 6-month window. Investment decisions, supply chain redesigns, political realignments all must happen in compressed time. This compression increases the likelihood of miscalculation and makes smooth adjustment impossible. The mechanism through which this affects real people is straightforward. Canadian workers in export-dependent industries face unemployment if their employers lose American market access. The automotive sector, forestry, agriculture, energy all employ hundreds of thousands of workers whose jobs depend on cross-border trade. When the institutional framework protecting that trade collapses or even appears likely to collapse, employers begin making contingency plans. Those plans involve reducing workforce, limiting expansion, potentially relocating facilities. The worker in Windsor, Ontario, who builds auto parts for the American market, doesn't care about the legal interpretation of Article 32.10. She cares whether her employer will keep the plant open. The agricultural producer in Saskatchewan faces the mirror image problem. Locked out of the Chinese market by tariffs, he needs that market reopened to move his crop. But reopening the Chinese market by reducing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles threatens to trigger American retaliation that could destroy the entire USMCA framework, which would eliminate the primary export market. There is no good option. This is what systemic fragility looks like at the individual level. Whatever choice is made creates losses for some constituency. The common objection to this analysis is that Canada and the United States are too economically integrated for either to allow the relationship to fracture. $3.6 billion crosses the border daily. 60% of American crude oil comes from Canada. The supply chains are too intertwined to unwind. This objection misunderstands how systems break. The integration itself is the vulnerability. The more dependent Canada becomes on American markets, the more leverage the United States gains. And that leverage can be deployed for purposes having nothing to do with economic efficiency or mutual benefit. Trump stated explicitly that Canada lives because of the United States. This is not diplomatic language. It is a clear assertion of hierarchical relationship. And from the perspective of economic dependency, it is not inaccurate. Canada's modern economic structure was built around American market access. That access was formalized through successive trade agreements, the Auto Pact, the Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and USMCA. Each iteration deepened the integration and therefore the dependency. The assumption was that rules-based frameworks would constrain both parties, but rules constrain only when both parties accept constraint. A sufficiently powerful party can simply ignore rules it finds inconvenient and suffer no meaningful consequences. The systemic convergence happening now involves multiple vectors: the USMCA review in July, the ongoing tariff disputes and threats, the China strategic competition forcing binary choices, the internal Canadian political fragmentation between regions with opposite interests, the global economic environment of slowing growth and rising protectionism. Each of these would be manageable individually. Their convergence in compressed time creates the conditions for catastrophic failure. Catastrophic in this context means the dissolution of institutional arrangements that have governed North American economic integration for over 30 years, with corresponding destruction of capital values built on assumptions of continued integration, triggering investment collapse, employment disruption, and potential political fragmentation within Canada itself. This would not necessarily look like the dramatic bank runs of 1929 or the liquidity freeze of 2008. It would look like gradually declining investment, rising unemployment in export sectors, capital flight to more stable jurisdictions, and political conflict between Canadian regions with diverging interests. At this stage of the cycle, historically, governments attempt to reassure markets and populations that they have the situation under control. Carney's careful statement that Canada is not pursuing a free trade agreement with China and respects CUSMA obligations is exactly this kind of reassurance. It is designed to signal to Washington that Canada understands the limits, while simultaneously claiming to domestic constituencies that Canada is acting independently. The problem is that both audiences understand the contradiction. Washington sees the China deal as a violation, regardless of legal technicalities. Domestic constituencies see the careful parsing as weakness and subordination. This is why the outcome feels inevitable once the structure is understood. Canada cannot simultaneously maintain full American market access and pursue independent trade policy with American strategic competitors. The attempt to do both guarantees failure at both, and the failure creates the conditions for accelerated wealth destruction through the mechanisms described. Not because Canadian workers become less productive or resources disappear, but because the institutional framework that allowed productive deployment of those resources collapses under strategic pressure it was never designed to withstand. The lie referenced in the title emerges clearly. Carney says no China deal while implementing exactly the kind of tariff reductions and market access provisions that constitute a deal. The parsing of free trade agreement versus sectoral arrangement is meaningless in the face of American strategic imperatives. Trump sees any enhanced Canada-China economic relationship as a threat to his China containment strategy. The specific legal classification of the agreement is irrelevant. The substance is what matters. And the substance is that Canada reduced barriers to Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for Chinese market access for Canadian agriculture. This is a deal. Calling it something else doesn't change the reality. The cave referenced in the title is more complex. Canada hasn't formally capitulated to the 100% tariff threat, but the mere existence of the threat, combined with Canada's structural vulnerability, ensures that Canadian policy will be constrained. Whether or not Carney explicitly backs away from the China arrangement, the knowledge that doing so triggers 100% tariffs means every future economic policy decision is made in the shadow of that threat. This is how sovereignty erodes, not through formal surrender, but through the gradual internalization of constraints imposed by a more powerful actor. What emerges from this analysis is a picture of systemic fragility masked by institutional facades. The rules-based international order, the stable trade frameworks, the institutional predictability that businesses and investors rely upon for long-term planning all rest on assumptions about great power behavior that are being revealed as false. When strategic competition intensifies, middle powers discover they have less autonomy than they believed. The economic structures built on assumptions of continued market access and institutional stability become vulnerable to sudden revaluation. This is why the system breaks and why the breaking feels sudden, despite being structurally determined. The participants in the system, from government policymakers to corporate investors to individual workers, operate based on assumptions embedded in institutional frameworks. When those frameworks are revealed as contingent rather than stable, all the calculations change simultaneously. The factory that made sense when USMCA market access was guaranteed becomes economically questionable when that access is threatened. The investment that generated returns when supply chains were stable generates losses when supply chains must be redesigned. The outcome is not foreordained in its details, but it is determined in its structure. Wealth will be destroyed through investment collapse, supply chain fragmentation, employment disruption, and capital flight. The magnitude depends on how quickly the recognition spreads and how severely the institutional frameworks are stressed. But the direction is set. The asymmetric dependency relationship between Canada and the United States, masked for decades by institutional frameworks that appeared to constrain both parties, is being revealed in its true form. And once revealed, it reshapes every economic calculation for every participant in the system.